Now, this is a question that comes up quite often. People want to know what the Kabbalah or the Kabbalah has to do with healing and therapy. And I think it has a lot to do with it because the very word Kabbalah comes from the Hebrew verb kibel, which means to receive. So, in some way, the study of Kabbalah is a study of how to receive the light. And the light and healing are kind of the same thing. Different words to describe kind of the same thing. In other words, every problem that we have, in a sense, is lack of light. And therefore, every healing is just the reception of the light. So, in many ways, all of Kabbalah has a lot to do with healing and therapy. Now, it's interesting because when people ask me, well, what about Kabbalah talks about specific healing? And it's a complex question to answer because there's so many different ways of looking at this. One of the ways in which we use some of the principles of Kabbalah all of the time in therapy is through the understanding of what came to be known as the seven Hermetic principles. The seven Hermetic principles basically provide us an understanding of how everything works. So therapy, as we do it, hypnotherapy, hypnosis, works at the level of the mind, not at the level of the brain, not at the level of the physical body. But the first Hermetic principle talks about the law of mentalism. All is mind. So by changing the mind, we change the physical. We change our lives by changing our minds. Edgar Cayce famously said, mind is the builder, physical is the result. And we end up building a future that has everything to do with what's in our minds. So the law of mentalism, the principle of mentalism, and then you have the principle of vibration. Not all thoughts vibrate equally. We have more elevated thoughts and less elevated thoughts. So the principle of vibration establishes the notion that by elevating our thoughts, we actually pull ourselves up, if you will. In other words, changing our minds is important. Actions, behaviors, words, all of them have a vibrational tone associated with them. And I'm not talking about like a mechanical vibration movement, but a certain amount of energy. And not all energies are at the same level. So a person's behavior, the way they entertain themselves, the way they live their lives, has a lot to do with how quickly or how effectively they receive their own healing. Because all of our actions, thoughts, behaviors, words, feelings have to be consistent, pointing in the same direction for things to happen. Then you have the law of correspondence, and it basically tells us that when two things are vibrating at the same level, they are in correspondence. This is where we get this notion that tell me who your friends are and I'll know something about you. Because by knowing who your friends are, I know who you're in correspondence with. So by the principle, the Hermetic principle of correspondence, we know that you are similar in some ways, and research bears this out, you're similar in some ways to your friends. So then you have the principle of polarity, which shows that everything that exists in two poles. You have day and night, man, woman, dry, wet, hot, cold, that kind of thing. There's always two poles to everything. So in relationships, for instance, you have this notion that, I'll give you an example, you might have, in a couple, you might have one person that spends a lot of money, and the other person is extremely careful with how they spend money. And so they have a lot of friction about this. One person is always complaining that the other spends too much, and the other person is complaining that this one is not generous enough. And they have friction. We see this in therapy all the time. The way people relate to money is really interesting because it comes from our notions about life that go way back. But notice something. These two people in this particular example that I just made up are vibrating in a way, the polarity of their behaviors are very far out and extreme. One person is extremely selfish. The other person spends a lot of money all the time. So let's say that one of the two comes into therapy and they say, well, my husband or my wife spends way too much money. Well, perhaps you're too stingy, and this is not how we do therapy. I'm just explaining this to you. So if this person were to become more generous along this axis, what they're doing is they're moving towards the center, and they actually help the other person move towards the center as well. So if they become more generous, the other person might become more conservative in their spending habits, and the couple has some peace. The point I'm making is, the more we exaggerate towards one pole, the more the compensating principle has to move towards the opposite pole. And we get this from Kabbalah, from the principle, the Hermetic principle of the law of polarity. And then you have the law of cause and effect, and that's an easy one to see how it applies to therapy. To every effect, there is a cause, and to every cause, there's an effect. When a person comes in to therapy, the problem that they're presenting didn't just happen, there's a cause to it. And in Kabbalah, we learned something called mental transmutation. What we really transmute, I mean, the cause exists at a mental level. The cause is mental, it's never an event. The cause of the problem is never an event. The event happened, but the cause is mental, is the conclusions that we derived from the event. So what we have to do is achieve something called mental transmutation. In other words, we have to change the cause, and by changing the cause, you change the effect, which is the problem that they came in to fix. Then you have the law of gender, which says that everything that exists in the form of male and female principle. So male and female doesn't just mean man and woman, although man and woman are one example of the law of gender. But for instance, everything that is active is male, and everything that is passive is female. So when you go somewhere, you're using a male type of energy. When you wait for somebody, you're using a female type of energy, and that type of thing. So everything occurs in those two kinds of energies. And that's how life works. Now, whenever there's a conflict, let's say in a couple, whenever they're fighting, notice something. By fighting, by conflict, what you automatically understand is a male energy. Because if the female energy is receptive, right? If you have two vacuums here, there's no way for them to collide, right? Because one is pulling this way, the other is pulling that way. How are they going to collide? When you think of a fight, a conflict, what you think of is this energy coming this way and encountering another energy that's coming this way. That's what we think of when you think of a fight or a conflict. So in a couple, despite the fact that typically you have a man and a woman, whenever there's fight, active fighting, you have two male energies colliding. So by the same token, when you have apathy, we haven't spoken to each other in 10 years. You know, I'm upset with her, she's upset with me, like there's apathy. See, there's the vacuum there. Then you have these two female energies interacting, which basically does not lend itself to the progress of the relationship. When those energies are balanced, according to the principle of Kabbalah, the person can heal, or the relationship can heal in this case. So all that I'm saying here is that Kabbalah is not a book. Kabbalah is a knowledge, a body of knowledge. There are books associated with Kabbalah, such as the Sefer Yetzirah, the Zohar. I mean, there are different kinds of books written based on those two and others. So there are many books about Kabbalah, but Kabbalah itself is not a book. It's a body of knowledge, and that body of knowledge explains all of life. It is extremely extensive. It explains all of life. And because it explains all of life, it also explains how problems happen and how to heal and recover from problems. So I would say that Kabbalah has everything to do with therapy and healing. And as students of Kabbalah, we use those principles quite a bit in this type of work. Good question. Thank you.